The following is a presentation of Surprise Church. El siguiente programa es una presentación de la iglesia Surprise.
That's one of my favorite Christmas movies. And am I alone on that one? We watch it every year. It's just good stuff. Sometimes life does feel a little bit like that, doesn't it? You know, you're going up to the top floor of the Empire State Building and some green guy comes in and pushes all the buttons. Or your own version of the story where someone comes into your life when you have your own plans, when you have your own schedule and pushes your buttons. Tonight we're going to talk about how when life seems to be going in one direction, sometimes it feels like the worst time in the world for an interruption. Sometimes it feels like the worst time in the world for a detour towards a person who maybe needs help, a problem that maybe comes up, a friend who needs a listening ear, or in the Christmas stories case, a baby who decides to be born in the most unlikely way. Sometimes you can go through life with expectations that get constantly dashed, where inconvenience comes up, or problem or failure comes up one way, shape, form, or another, and it can be really frustrating. So on the one hand, you can think about life, if you want to be happy, you have to keep your expectations low. One of my favorite talk show hosts, Dennis Prager, that's a mantra of his. He says, keep your expectations low. That is the key to being happy. Just expect bad things to happen. At the same time, and I think there's good wisdom in that, at the same time, we're here tonight for a very, very different reason. We're here tonight because of an opposite, an opposing reason. Where we're told in the story we're going to hear tonight to expect the miraculous. We're told through the story that we celebrate this and every Christmas to expect that certain things are not going to limit us, going to stop us, because we have a God who steps in and does miraculous things. And so we should actually expect miracles. And we're scolded in Scripture when we don't. Jesus came to his hometown, and they didn't have any faith in him because they saw him as a kid growing up, and they just didn't expect miracles. And he says, I can't do anything here. Nobody believes in me. Hebrews says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. It says that faith is the assurance of things that we hope for and the conviction of things that we can't see, but we know God can do. And without faith, our ancestors would have pleased God. So the Bible story, the Christmas story, is about raising your expectations for God's miraculous power in a world where one time after another, expectations can get dashed. It's a conflict. And to me, it's all about timing. Any guys with me, my timing is terrible. In fact, my wife, when we were dating, she just didn't get me, and I thought I was kind of playing it cool, you know? And she actually had a deadline, like if he doesn't call me and ask me to do something by this date, I'm moving on. And luckily, God kicked me in the head, and I actually called her that day. And, you know, the rest is bliss and history, of course. But I was dense. My timing has never been very good. And that continued when we even had babies. The first time we had our first child, Lila, we went to the parenting class before, you know, the first time parenting class where all the parents' hands are shaking, and they come with a 60 bullet point list of questions that you ask because you just don't know what you're getting into, and you want to be able to answer every single question right and be ready for every single variable, and you buy your own stethoscope just to make sure you're cool and ready. And so I went to that class, and I listened and I took notes like it was a graduate level class. I was ready for this baby. I practiced my massage technique. As a dad, I was ready to play my role to provide the proper massage at the perfect time. I also wrote script by script, word by word, what the nurses said to say to your wife when she is in that mode of labor, birthing, whatever you want to call it. When she's there, here's what you say. You're doing great, honey. In a nice, soothing, soft voice. Did you hear that? Turn the subwoofer up. You're doing great, honey. No, I'm so proud of you. Keep breathing. And I had about 5 or 6 things that I was ready with. This was going to be the textbook birthing partner performance. I was ready. It was the perfect time. Here we go. We go to the hospital, and I went through my script, and I was trying multiple times to provide the back rub that I had practiced against the wall with, just to make sure I got it right. And I've never heard "don't touch me" so many times. So I figured, let's do the verbal, okay? So I had all the verbal, and I've never heard "please be quiet" so many times. Can you turn the music up and please be quiet? And we both worked really hard all day to make this happen, in our own ways, of course. I just trying to stay out of the way, and obviously she doing what great moms do, and it wasn't happening. Lila, if you know her, she's fairly strong-willed. She just wasn't coming. And so about 7, 8 o'clock, I'm like, this has been hard work. I'm hungry. And I got to look, and then I said, I'm going to get something to eat if that's okay. And she's like, yeah, fine. So I walked out, and 30 minutes later, I came back, and she was just ready to have the baby. I just needed to leave. My timing all day was off. I should have just gone and got something to eat at 9 in the morning instead of 9 at night. We'd have had this baby in no time. So the second time we had a baby, you'd think I'd learned my lesson. No. Here I am all day, honey. You're doing okay, so I'll be quiet. Here's your background. Okay, I won't tell you. Nothing was working. I was in there. I had the script. I had my notes from our first baby class, and nothing was working. And finally, she looks at me about 8 o'clock. I look back at her. She nods. I nod. I'm leaving. Half hour later, I come back. She has the baby. Again, here we go, right? So for our third baby, I just booked plane tickets and left town. I just get to stay away from this one. It worked out a little bit better. No, I was there. It worked out fine. But I've always had bad timing. And when you hear the Christmas story, it does sound like the God of bad timing. It sounds like a story about a God who's like, I'll throw a dart at the calendar, and I guess I'll go throw a dart at the globe, and I guess I'll go there. It kind of seems like a weird, random, chaotic sequence of events that if you could script it, it would be the opposite of what you do. Let me show you what I mean. In those days, this is Luke chapter 2, the great Christmas story. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. A couple things about this, one verse. Caesar Augustus was the Roman emperor. This is the world power of the time. And they would have a phrase about Caesar Augustus. They would say, Caesar Augustus, the bringer of peace. Augustus brings peace. The emperor will bring peace. Of course, he was a very bloody emperor in a very bloody empire that shed a lot of blood to bring about the peace that they promised. But his name, as kind of a propaganda thing, was associated with peace. Luke starts the Christmas story about the King of Kings coming to bring peace, naming the earthly king who everyone else said was supposed to bring peace. Very intentional way of telling the story. He came in an era of the king who was the bringer of peace, Caesar Augustus. And this king, the bringer of peace, demanded that everybody in the whole country get counted for a census. And it says in verse 2, it was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. Now, how would you like that? Like if the president said, hey, you're going to have to go to your own town, we're going to count you, and, it would be very inconvenient. Mandated forced travel plans, mandated mass migration. Imagine the freeway, imagine the grocery stores, imagine the roads, imagine Dick's Sporting Goods and Shields, stocking up, and dams. It would be crazy, pandemonium. I know it's hard for us to imagine that level of government inefficiency today, but back then, that's crazy. Like, that's the worst way to do a sentence. Most of the time, their taxes were all local affairs, but here they did it like a national thing, which again, we don't understand government efficiency today, but back then it was really a weird way of doing it. They didn't do it this way often. So everyone, including Joseph, has to go. So Joseph went also up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. They weren't married, but they were pregnant. They were engaged. So he was the legal father, according to the laws at the time, but they had spent their courtship in shame of an unwed birth. And Joseph stood by her side at God's command to just kind of walk with her, be with her. And then this census, where you have to take your wife who's full term. They don't have birth classes to figure out how to ride a donkey to Bethlehem. They don't have those. Joseph was probably beyond his element here. He probably didn't know what to do, but let's just have to give this a try and see what happens. So they get to Bethlehem. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths, which was customary to do to a child, and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. How would you have done it? Let's say you're God, hanging out on your throne, with nothing better to do but kind of keep the planets floating, and you're like, I think I'm going in. I'm going in. So you pack your backpack and you get some Lunchables and a can of Coke, throw it in there, and you just start off. When and where would you have done it? If you're the author of life, what time of history would you have plopped down? Colonial America, ancient Egypt. If I were God, I would have waited till there was like a 1,000,000-man march around like one of the pyramids, and I would float down out of heaven, glowing, fireworks shooting out of my brain, fancy, shiny, brilliant outfit, and I would come for all to see in a very clear, very powerful demonstration of I'm the man. You're not going to miss me. Don't worry, I'm right here. How would you have done it? This is how he did it. Talk about bad timing. I mean, just the level of busyness that God chose to enter in is unbelievable. Look at this list. This is the context in which God, when he had infinite timeline of human history to choose from, this is the one he chose. A time of political upheaval where the government just says everybody has to go. Everybody just has to find their hometown, go. It's a crazy time. Economic issues, all the taxation, financial issues that go along with taxation, as well as travel, budgeting for travel, providing food when you're not able to just go to your garden or go to your field or go to your cow. Travel logistics. I mean, there was no AAA, there was no travel agency. This was just dare to do a long journey and hope that you make it. Family details of travel, unplanned onward birth in Joseph and Mary's case, making this all the more complicated and complex. Competition when they get to the city, there's all kinds of out-of-town guests, so who gets to stay? Well, first come, first serve, folks. Competition for resources, food, shelter, everything. And then, of course, as the story continues, there's animals, shepherds, and wise men. Oh my, this is a crazy story. This is, if God could pick the most busy, chaotic, confusing time, this would be it. And all this, again, taking place in a nation, a poor nation, occupied by a strong nation with soldiers posted everywhere. I wouldn't have done it this way. Not that my timing is so great, which we've already established, I would not have done it this way. You could say that the Christmas story is a story of ultimate bad timing, which means, guys, you and I are in good company. We're like God. Except, as you dig a little bit deeper, if we're just now at the surface of the garden and we start digging in the dirt, and if we go a little bit deeper into these words and kind of peer a little bit more fully into what they're telling us, we might not see such a mistaken moment. We may not be looking at bad timing. And this is as we think of bad timing. Look at these two verses. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Now, you could read this as she had to have a baby because it needed to come out. Or you could read this in the second way that it's possible as this was the time God chose. This was not an accident. God chose this exact moment and this exact time in history. The time came for her to have the child. Which time? Said by the next verse. She placed him in a manger, which is a cattle trough, which is like a very old, kind of a rustic wooden trough. We've kind of glamorized them as we celebrate Christmas, but there was no spotlight down in it, no strategically placed hay and well-groomed camel. This was, at best, a basement cave. God came, and the first place they laid him was a cattle feeding trough. I grew up on a farm. Those things ain't clean, folks. Sometimes the cattle turn around and do what they shouldn't do where they're going to eat. You know what I'm saying? They're not clean. She placed him in a manger because there was, look at these words, no room for them in the inn. The right time for God to come was when there was no room for him in his hometown. The right time for God to enter into the human race was the time where there was no room for him to be born in a hospitable place. It was almost as if God, when he thought about when would be the perfect way for me to enter into the world, made the same decision as it was when he exited the world on the cross, when there was just no room for him. They didn't want him. They had other things to do. They were too busy. They had other priorities. God chose the right time as the time where there was no room. On your sermon notes inside the bulletin that I gave you, it's just kind of some blank space for you to write down notes. I really recommend doing that because sometimes we experience something and we want to remember something, but when we leave, our brain just kind of flushes everything we don't know. We get 5,000 messages a day from media and culture, and here's something you might want to write down and not flush as you leave. Our worst times are God's perfect times. Say that with me, nice and bold. Our worst times are God's perfect times. That means if you're in a situation in your life where you see not what you planned, there's a little green elf pushing your buttons, there's a problem that you didn't plan on, there's a health issue you didn't plan on, there's a budgetary challenge you didn't forecast, there's a schedule change that you didn't want, there's a conflict that you didn't start, there's a burden that you didn't want to have a part of your life story, there's a person in need in your life that you wouldn't want having to rely on you. This is the worst time. This is not what you planned. And the story of Jesus being born in a manger reminds us that sometimes our worst times are God's best times, that we may not have planned it that way, but we're not the great planner he is, and so we have to respond in faith saying, well, God, what can you do in my worst? What if we looked at God not as some cosmic rule maker, not as some behavioral therapist, not as some guy who wants to just give you a list of to-dos and to-don'ts, but a God who wants to step in to the biggest mess we can come up with. He's just like, come on, bring it on. Show me your worst. That means that church, one of the reasons I like wearing kind of casual clothes to church is because sometimes we think of church as a Christian prom, where it's like, let's get cleaned up, put our best face on, go sing some nice songs, and then go back to a challenging world. And so the God box becomes irrelevant to the rest of our lives, which are challenging, full of relationships and chaos and some difficulty and needs, decisions. Here, when we get done with church, we say the church has left the building. Now, God wants to take you into the life that he planned for you and walk you through the challenges that he's allowing you to face. Because sometimes our worst times are perfect times for God to demonstrate his presence, demonstrate his power, and demonstrate his capacity to help us walk with what we otherwise could not, and therein lies the reason why he lets us experience those things. If he let us kind of have a vacation of a life, we would delude ourselves into thinking we don't need him. But he himself came at the worst time to enter into everything that we could experience in order to walk us through life. So the world was and is broken with busyness. This was and is the perfect time for God to send his son, a carpenter. Ironic trade that he ended up having to fix us. I'd like you to raise your expectations, even though I know there's a risk there that if you think God might be able to do more than maybe you thought he did yesterday, if you think God might be more capable, more loving, more hopeful, I know there's a risk there that he's going to disappoint you. But he's not afraid of disappointing you. And he doesn't want you afraid of trusting him. He doesn't want you afraid of relying on him. He wants to fix us, and he wants us to lean on him in the times that he provides for us in which we are going to be stretched beyond our capacity. Hebrews 1 says it this way: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. In other words, there were time after time after time throughout the story leading up to Jesus coming where God tried everything. He sent kings, prophets, priests, judges, leaders of all bands and sizes and shapes and varieties, and they meant to represent God, speak his message, and point his people in the right direction. But in many cases, they were just too busy to listen. Other priorities, other values trumped God's message to them, and they choose a different way of living. Trace the story all the way back to Genesis. That's what happened. We think we know better on our own. Jesus was born into a world that thought it knew better, and oftentimes still does, except he decided to deal with that differently. Instead of continuing to send people to say, you're not doing it right, instead of continuing to send people that represent God, he decided to come himself. He decided to come with us at our worst, and he decided to send his own son. I want to speak as clearly as I can. I want to speak as forcefully as I can. In fact, I want to say this myself. I'm coming. We've been in John chapter 1 for the last couple of weeks, just looking at this beautiful prologue, it's called, of John's gospel. We've gotten to this point, and then he just drops this amazingly cool bomb and says, no one has ever seen God. There's a distance, a gap, a barrier between humankind and God. No one's ever seen God, but God, the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. In other words, God didn't want to come to give us more rules. He came for us. He didn't want to choose the best time when things were easy, when things are going great, because again, he wanted us to recognize our need for him and experience our worst and die with it on the cross. So the night before he was betrayed, he was eating bread, as we're going to do after church today, in communion, and wine with his disciples. And something really interesting happened at that meal. You see here, it says, God, who is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. The words that we translate for the closest relationship with the Father, literally translated from the Greek language that it was written in, mean to have your head right here. Now go ahead and find someone you don't know and just put your head right there. I'll give you a minute. Why is no one listening? It takes, a couple of you, because you have a close relationship, I hope. Or now you do. It takes a close relationship to be that intimate with someone. John's gospel starts with, there's a Son, in this unique mystery of the Trinity, a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. The Son, God himself, has a relationship with the Father God in which his head is resting upon him. And he came to make him known. So at the end of John's gospel, you know what happens when they're having communion together? There's this unnamed disciple called the beloved disciple. John doesn't name him intentionally because he wants us to see ourselves in that beloved disciple's place. And that beloved disciple's place, while they're sharing communion, guess where his head is? Right here. Jesus came to share what he had with his Father, with a world that was too busy to notice. Another way you can think of Jesus is the prodigal son. This church is named after the story in the Bible known as the prodigal son. How many of you have heard of the prodigal son story? It's out there like Noah's Ark. If someone comes home from college or doesn't come home for a long time and then they come home, usually the parents say, welcome home, prodigal. It's kind of like the rebellious kid come home story. Except when the rebellious kid comes home, the father throws him a surprise party. That's how we named this church. We want to be a church that throws surprise parties for lost sons and daughters when they come home to God with low expectations, expecting punishment or worse. And we throw parties and say God loves you and he welcomes you and he came for you. Except there was an older brother in the story who wasn't excited about his younger brother getting a party because he didn't think his younger brother deserved a party, but he did. And so instead of going and celebrating, he stays outside with his arms folded when the music's playing. And sometimes we can do that too. We can think we deserve God's love and someone else doesn't, so I'm not going to be a part of the team that helps God reach others for him. And then as Jesus tells a story, he finishes. And then what he does is he steps himself into the story like he stepped into the world itself and plays the role of the good older brother in the story who goes to his father and says, Father, send me. I want to save my lost brothers and sisters. And I want to go and I want to do everything I can, even die for them, to bring them home to the great surprise party that you have planned for the world. Jesus tells a story about the prodigal son because he's the good older brother and he invites us to follow him in that. He's the prodigal son's son. So what we do as a church is we look for places that might otherwise be terrible timing, and we say that's perfect timing to showcase God's love. We went down to the mall a couple days ago, last week. It's a busy time right down there. There's a trade show, there's vendor booths, there's kids crying and playing in the Kidland thing. I mean, it's Santa's over there. I mean, it's nuts. We set up shop, started playing Christmas songs. 100 people came and just pounded out the Christmas songs with us. It was awesome. We don't want to stay in a box. Jesus didn't stay on the throne. He came and decided that our worst time, our most busiest time, was the best time to break in and set a new tone. We've been doing the Lighthouse campaign this month because we think this busy holiday season is the perfect time for us to declare that we want our houses to be lighthouses, that we aren't just in our neighborhoods because we like the neighborhood. We're in our neighborhoods because God put us there. And when Jesus said, what's the most important thing you do? He said, love God and love your neighbors. And so after church today, I want to invite you to say that this is the perfect time to be a lighthouse. Stop over at our map and look for your address. We have a globe and we have the local map, so you should be able to find yourself unless you're not from this planet. And put a tack on your address, go to our website, and learn how to be a lighthouse in your neighborhood. How to say, you know, it's a busy time of year, it's a cold time of year, but people in my neighborhood need light. And I want to be one part of the solution that God has for my neighborhood. It's a perfect time. 2 weeks ago, we had an opportunity, last-minute opportunity, thanks to Katie and other generous givers here in our church, who said, you know what, we got to do a giving tree. And so they called Ruth Myers, and they said, we got 8 or 10 families who just don't have Christmas plans. They don't have gifts coming in, and sure, you can help. And so we came to church, and I said, we know this is last minute, folks. We got a sign-up sheet. We got all these kids and all these needs. And sure enough, within 10 minutes, this church had adopted all those kids and gotten our Christmas presents. We piled a pile of gifts last Sunday, and after church, we went down and delivered them, and the families were there. You talk about the prodigal son. The look in the prodigal son's face when the father had a surprise party planned, I think it looked something like this. That's what kind of God you have. Who says our need is perfect. Our sin is just perfect. Our brokenness is just perfect. He is not waiting for you to get cleaned up to come to him. He is not waiting for you to get it right before you get him. He welcomes you right here. He's looking to bless you at your worst, to step into our mess, and to redirect us towards a more full life, one in which we live with intimacy with him, where we have one experience after another like this, where we have one experience after another like, I am getting what I do not deserve, and where we stand side by side with him and do that for others. It's a perfect time. It's a busy time of year. It's a perfect time to do that. One other thing you might want to take down, life happens when we refuse to be too busy for God. Our next series in January, it's called Breaking Busy, kind of a play off the show Breaking Bad, not a family show. I'm not telling you to go and watch it as a family, but it's a play off of that. And we have a little trailer video that we want to show you that talks about what do you do with the 86,400 seconds you get every day? And is busyness breaking you? So let's watch. If you could do me a favor right now, we're going to actually have a second smartphone moment. If you would grab your smartphone. One of the last things we're doing our time together today, before we do our candlelight song, I just want to encourage you to invite someone. Because I have a feeling that if this sermon series, which is for me, by the way, I need this sermon series, so I'm preaching this. I have a feeling it might be for you, and I have a feeling it might be for a lot of people in your life. So if you wouldn't mind, on the top of our Facebook page, near the top at least, is the video you just watched. I want to encourage you just to take some time and at this very moment, write something like what might be on the screen. Who's coming with me? Who else needs this? And I promise you, someone in your life is going to really, really appreciate that. It might be the worst time, but I think it's probably the best time too. If the statistics are true, there's a point where it just can't go on. We're killing ourselves. And we're going to take a look at busyness. We're going to look busyness square in the eyes this next month, and we're going to say, what does God want with the 86,400 seconds we get every day? We're told in the Christmas story to expect a miracle, and tonight we take God at his word. We're told in the Christmas story that nothing, neither life itself or death itself, can separate us from the love of God, because God has come and God has claimed us. And if that's true, that changes how we would address the challenges that are ahead of us and how we would relate to the people that God has put around us. I invite you to look at the worst times as the best time for God to work. This time I'm going to have you get your candles ready. I'm going to invite our candle people forward to get their candles lit. In a minute, they're going to light yours. And as they do that, they're going to come up the aisles. Come on forward, guys. You can get lit. They're going to light you guys on the inside of the aisles, and then you might have to stand up to pass. but we're going to have you just kind of share the light, symbolic, kind of cool gesture with the people all the way to the outside of our worship space. If you have a lit candle, make sure that you hold that upright, and while the person that unlit tilts it and lights yours. And as you're sharing and as you're exchanging light, just notice how the light, as you share it, it multiplies rather than you have to give yours away, and that's a perfect picture of the gospel itself. As you see the worst times as perfect times for God to act, you actually share something but get it back, if we're not too busy to let God use us. So as the light comes around, we're just going to kind of put this video up to set our tone, a mental tone, as we prepare for the singing of Silent Night by candlelight. Let's watch.